One of the senators on the Democratic side, after the briefing that he got from Marco Rubio yesterday, was not impressed. Here's what Chris Murphy said.
This is an insane plan. They are talking about stealing the Venezuelan oil at gunpoint for a period of time undefined as leverage to micromanage the country. We learned a lot. I'm glad we had the briefing, but this is going to be a very, very rough ride for the United States.
We are looking at two major breaking stories tonight that test the very limits of American power, both at home and abroad. In Washington, a showdown is looming in the Senate over war powers and a plan for Venezuela that could last for years. Meanwhile, in Minneapolis, a tragic shooting involving federal agents has sparked a new wave of protests. The questions are getting harder, and the answers from leadership are signaling a long, rough road ahead. Good evening. We have a lot to get to tonight. We are going to start with a developing situation that sits right at the intersection of American foreign policy, executive power, and the constitutional role of the United States Senate. It is a story about how we define intervention, how we define the timeline of that intervention, and what happens when the White House and Congress view the same set of facts through completely different lenses. We are watching a very specific clock ticking down in the nation's capital right now. We are awaiting a vote in the Senate. This is not a minor procedural vote. This is a vote on a war powers resolution, and context matters here. This vote is happening against a backdrop of news that has just broken regarding the president's intentions in South America. While the Senate is gearing up to cast their votes that will go on the permanent record regarding war and peace, President Trump has been sitting down with the New York Times, and in that interview the president laid out a vision, or perhaps a warning, about the scope of American involvement in Venezuela. This is the news that is rippling through the hallways of the Capitol right now. According to the reports coming out of that interview, the president is looking at a timeline that is not measured in days and not measured in weeks. He is talking about the oversight of a country that could last for years. That is the word that is hanging in the air. Years. When the reporter from the New York Times pressed for specifics, because of course when you are talking about foreign intervention, the American people usually want to know the exit strategy. The president reportedly did not give a precise time range. He did not say we will be out by Christmas. He did not say this is a 6-month operation. The president's reply, according to the report, was that he would say it could be much longer, and then he added the qualifier that really defined so much of this moment. No one knows at this point. No one knows at this point.
Senate vote on a war powers resolution. It comes as President Trump sits down with the New York Times, laying out his plan for Venezuela. The president reportedly telling the newspaper the oversight of the country could last for years. And joining us now is Senate Majority Leader John Thune. Here's the quote from the reporter writing that Trump did not give a precise time range for how long the United States would remain in Venezuela's political overlord. Would it be 3 months, 6 months, a year, longer? I would say much longer, the president replied. I guess no one really knows at this point, but
that is the landscape upon which the Senate is trying to legislate today. You have a war powers resolution on the floor. The goal of a war powers resolution, historically, is to assert congressional authority, to put a check on the executive branch, to make sure that the United States does not drift into open-ended conflicts without the consent of the people's representatives. And yet, at the exact moment this mechanism is being deployed, you have the executive branch signaling that the timeline is undefined, that the commitment is open-ended, and that the oversight could stretch on for years. So the question becomes, what is the goal? What is actually happening in the Senate versus what is happening in the White House? We have heard from Senate Majority Leader John Thune on this exact issue. Senator Thune is looking at this war powers resolution, and he is looking at the Democratic push for it, and he is labeling it very clearly. He calls it a political vote.
War powers resolution, what is the goal of that, and how do you think the vote will go?
Well, what they're attempting, it's a political vote, Dana. This is the Democrats trying to, poke the president, and I hope that we have the votes to defeat it.
From the perspective of the Senate Majority Leader, this isn't about the mechanics of war. It is about the mechanics of politics. He expressed a hope, a very clear hope, that the Republicans have the votes to defeat it. But why? Why defeat a resolution that seeks to define war powers? According to Senator Thune, you have to look at the justification for the president's actions. You have to look at who is on the other side of this conflict in Venezuela. The argument coming from the Republican leadership is that what President Trump is doing, what he laid out in that New York Times interview, is something that has broad support, and Senator Thune argues that this support isn't just a Washington bubble phenomenon. He claims this is supported by folks across the country, and here is the core of that argument. It centers on Nicolas Maduro. The characterization of Maduro here is critical to understanding the administration's posture. Senator Thune is not describing Maduro simply as a dictator or a failed political leader. He is using very specific, criminal language. He describes Maduro as leading a drug cartel.
What the president did there is something that's supported broadly, not just by folks here in Washington, D.C., but across the country, because Maduro was leading a drug cartel that was poisoning literally thousands of Americans every single year. And so bringing him to justice is a worthwhile goal.
This is the justification. The argument is that this cartel was poisoning thousands of Americans every single year. So when you frame the adversary not just as a head of state, but as the head of a narcotics trafficking operation that is actively harming U.S. citizens, the military and intelligence calculus shifts. Senator Thune calls the effort to bring Maduro to justice a worthwhile goal. He is offering congratulations to the men and women in uniform and to the intelligence community for taking the action necessary to bring him to the United States. The end game, according to the senator, is a courtroom. The goal is to have Maduro stand up for himself in court. So that is the case for the defense. That is the argument for why this long-term oversight, this years-long potential involvement, is necessary. It is framed as a law enforcement and national security imperative to dismantle a drug cartel. But that is only one half of the conversation happening in Washington. Because while Senator Thune is praising the plan, you have a completely different reaction coming from the other side of the aisle. And this is where the narrative really splits. We need to talk about the briefing that senators received. Before these public statements are made, there are briefings. Information is shared. And one of the senators who walked out of that briefing was Democrat Chris Murphy. Senator Murphy did not mince words. He did not talk about this as a difference of opinion on strategy. He didn't say, "I have some concerns about the timeline." He called the plan insane. That is the word he used. An insane plan. And he went further. He described what he believes the administration is actually suggesting. And this is a very serious accusation to make about American foreign policy. Senator Murphy said that they are talking about, and I am quoting his characterization here, stealing the Venezuelan oil at gunpoint. Stealing the Venezuelan oil at gunpoint.
And congratulate the men and women in uniform and of course in our intelligence community and the President of the United States for taking the kind of action that was necessary to get him here in this country where he's gonna have to stand up for himself in court.
One of the senators on the Democratic side, after the briefing that he got from Marco Rubio yesterday, was not impressed. Here's what Chris Murphy said.
This is an insane plan. They are talking about stealing the Venezuelan oil at gunpoint for a period of time undefined as leverage to micromanage the country.
He describes a scenario where the United States uses this leverage for a period of time that is again undefined. Remember the president's words. No one knows at this point. Senator Murphy sees that undefined timeline as a window to micromanage the country. He acknowledged that they learned a lot in the briefing. He said he was glad they had the briefing, but his conclusion was stark. He predicts a rough ride for the United States. So pause for a second and look at the chasm between these two viewpoints. On one side, you have the Senate Majority Leader describing a noble effort to take down a drug cartel leader who is poisoning Americans, a plan supported by the country, with the goal of justice in a court of law. On the other side, you have a Democratic senator describing an insane scheme to steal oil at gunpoint and micromanage a foreign nation indefinitely. These aren't just minor disagreements. These are two completely different realities being described by people sitting in the same body of government. Now, this accusation about the oil, the idea that the U.S. is there to steal it, was put directly to Senator Thune. It is a charge that requires a response, and his response shifts the focus entirely to the global stage. Senator Thune's defense is that it is not the United States that is stealing Venezuelan oil. He points the finger at the other major superpowers involved in the region. He says it's the Chinese and Russians stealing Venezuelan oil. This introduces the geopolitical layer to this crisis. It isn't just about Maduro and Trump. It is about the influence of Russia and China in the Western Hemisphere. Thune argues that what the president is attempting to do is to get Venezuela back to a place where the country itself benefits from its own energy production. He sees the United States playing an important role here. And the key word he uses is leverage, economic leverage. The argument is that the United States has the economic leverage to lessen the reliance that Venezuela currently has on Russia and China, and Senator Thune describes the influence of Russia and China as malign. He frames their presence in this hemisphere as a direct national security threat to the United States. So, under this logic, the intervention isn't about taking the oil for America. It is about denying the strategic advantage to adversaries like Russia and China and stabilizing the region. But there is also a humanitarian argument being made by the majority leader. He talks about liberating the people of Venezuela. He describes them as being held hostage by Maduro. He points out that the people aren't getting the benefit of their own economy. They aren't seeing the wealth from those vast resources that are sitting right beneath their feet. So Senator Thune says the plan laid out by the president and by Secretary Rubio makes a lot of sense. He says it makes sense for the security of the hemisphere. He says it makes sense for the security of the United States. And he says it makes sense for the people of Venezuela who desperately need to be liberated from a regime they have lived under for many years. But let's talk about that oil for a moment, because it is the elephant in the room. We know there are meetings happening. We know that American oil executives are scheduled to meet with the president. The question is, are they ready to go in? Venezuela has massive reserves, but the infrastructure is dilapidated. The political situation is volatile. It is one thing to have a plan on paper in Washington. It is another thing to have a multinational corporation send its people and its equipment into a zone of instability. When asked if these companies are ready to pump oil, Senator Thune admitted that it depends. It depends largely on the circumstances on the ground. You cannot have investment without stability. That is the basic rule of global economics. Thune emphasized that we need to be supportive of a government there. He talked about the hope for free and fair elections in the not-too-distant future. But notice the phrasing again, not-too-distant future. It echoes the undefined timeline the president mentioned. Senator Thune believes the companies are willing to invest, but they have a checklist. They are looking at the rule of law. They are looking at whether or not those investments will be protected. You don't sink billions of dollars into energy infrastructure if you think it might be seized or destroyed the next day. So the president and his team are trying to give definitive answers to those executives. They are trying to create an assurance of stability so that the investment can get underway. But as of right now, with the timeline unknown and the political battle raging in the Senate, those definitive answers might be hard to come by. Now, while this geopolitical drama plays out with war powers and oil reserves, there is another breaking story developing right here at home. It is a story that also touches on the use of force, the role of federal agents, and the deep divisions within our own country. We are turning our attention to Minneapolis. We have seen breaking news out of that city regarding a tragic incident involving a protester and law enforcement. The details are still coming into focus, but here is what we know based on the reports and the statements from officials. A woman was killed, she was a protester, and this happened in the context of a confrontation with Federal Immigration Enforcement, IC. There is an investigation underway to determine exactly what happened, but the Department of Homeland Security has already issued a statement regarding the actions of the deceased. DHS has said that she was using her vehicle as a weapon. That is the specific claim from the Department of Homeland Security, using her vehicle as a weapon. Following that action, she was shot by an officer. Now, as you can imagine, this has triggered an immediate response on the streets. Protests are erupting in the city, and the concern, the very real concern among leadership, is that we are going to see more of this across the country. This isn't just an isolated incident in one city. It feels like a flashpoint in a much larger struggle over immigration enforcement and the presence of federal agents in American communities. Senator Thune addressed this directly. He was asked what can be done. How do you de-escalate a situation like this? How do you explain to the American people the role of ICE in these moments? Senator Thune began by acknowledging the tragedy. He called it a tragic loss of life. He called it unnecessary. But he then pivoted to the broader trend he sees. He views what happened in Minneapolis as an indication of an uptick across the country. He described a pattern of protesters starting to attack ICE officers. He described attacks on law enforcement officers who are trying to lawfully enforce immigration law. And this is where the senator's message turned to the political leadership in our cities and states. He issued a call to action for mayors and governors. And he was specific. He said red or blue. This wasn't a partisan call-out. It was a call to executives at the state and local level. He said they need to make sure they are sending a message. And that message is that protests and protesters need to act in accordance with our laws. His warning was stark. When you cross lines, there will be consequence. In the view of the Senate Majority Leader, the situation in Minneapolis involved people trying to do a job. He expressed support and respect for these law enforcement officers, for ICE, for the Border Patrol. He noted that Law Enforcement Day is approaching, and he emphasized that these officers need to know that the people of this country and their elected leaders stand with them. He framed their work not just as a job, but as a mandate. He said they are doing the job they are being asked to do, and he connected it directly to the White House. He said it is frankly a job that the American president, President Trump, was elected to deliver for the American people. So you have this very tense dynamic. On the streets, you have protests, tragedy, and a loss of life. You have federal agents involved in a shooting, and from the Senate leadership, you have a reinforcement of the law and order message, a defense of ICE, and a warning that attacking federal officers will have consequences. As we watched the live feeds from Minneapolis earlier, it was noted that in the last 20 minutes or so, the scene seemed to calm down somewhat. There appeared to be more federal officers on the scene. The immediate volatility had decreased compared to where it was just 30 minutes prior. But the underlying tension, that hasn't gone anywhere. Whether we are talking about the streets of Minneapolis or the political fight over Venezuela, the common thread is a debate over power, authority, and the length of the road ahead. In Venezuela, the president says oversight could last for years. No one knows at this point. The Senate is voting on whether to try and pull back those war powers, while the majority leader defends the plan as a necessary strike against a drug cartel and a move to block Russian and Chinese influence. In Minneapolis, a confrontation has turned deadly, sparking a debate about protest, safety, and the enforcement of federal law. These are not simple days. The timelines are undefined. The outcomes are uncertain. And as the Senate prepares to vote and the investigations in Minneapolis begin, the one thing we know for sure is that the answers are not going to come quickly. We will continue to track the vote count in the Senate as it happens. We will continue to monitor the situation on the ground in Minneapolis, and we will keep looking for clarity on just how long years really means when it comes to American involvement overseas. From Washington to Minneapolis, the news continues. Stay tuned.